So let's say you're going to a job interview and getting asked, okay, but why do you want to leave your current role? And your answer essentially would be because of your boss. Now, would this be a good idea? And I'll actually let you decide this for yourself, but I wanted to give you a couple of tips and tricks when it comes from the HR's perspective on these things. And after coaching a couple of hundred candidates, I was actually surprised myself to find out quite a few instances where people would hire me for 1 hour and use that first half an hour to talk about how bad their boss is. And I believe this is a perfect scenario where a candidate would actually make for a very toxic employee. And this is actually something that you wouldn't expect an employer to be so careful with, especially during the first screening rounds of this interview. And if you put yourself in a recruiter's shoes, you'd probably understand this is the worst case scenario, actually. So you want to avoid this at all costs. So tip number one, be aware that employers are very, very careful with these things. The second tip I want to give you here is that most likely what you want to communicate will not sound the same when you communicate it. So in other words, if you want to say that, hey, yes, it's because of my boss, of course, probably not as straightforward as this, you must train yourself in advance to talk about these things. Tip number 3 here. What are some signs that a candidate might be a toxic employee? The first sign is overly negative. A long, boring monologue talking about something else. And actually, this was tip number 2. If you talk about something else in a job interview, chances are you're really not the best candidate for the role, because the idea is that the job interview is supposed to be about yourself, about you showcasing your skills, not about what he said, she said type of things. So beware of these 2 signs of toxic employees as well. Be prepared to really dive uncomfortably deep into these things, especially when it comes to interpersonal skills. So if you really had struggles with your boss, first make peace with yourself on these things. As I said in the beginning, train yourself to talk about it, but don't just train yourself to have a 2-minute answer to this. Train yourself to really dive deep to these things. Ideally, even get coached on these things, even do some role play. I have also a free role play service if you want to try it out. How do they screen you against these things? What are some examples of questions that you might expect in a job interview that you should be particularly careful with? Of course, it should go without saying why are you leaving your current role. This is the most common one. But another one would be a time when you had a conflict with your manager, right? So your interpersonal skills and a conflict with your manager. Here, my advice would be do not use a failure story. So when you have a conflict, talk about the conflict that resolved successfully, right? Second example, when you were provided with tough feedback and how did you respond? So here I would suggest you to talk about the situation where you were wrong, because if you talk about the situation where you were provided wrongfully with a tough feedback, that would show that you are some sort of ideal candidate, and there's no such thing in a real case scenario. So if you choose an example, choose one that will showcase that you listen to that feedback and essentially talk about your learnings, because this is actually a failure story. So you should focus on how you grew from that tough feedback. Another example would be a time when you pitched something unsuccessfully, or what's your biggest professional regret, if you want, would be a synonym on the same side. These types of failure types of stories, when you pitch something unsuccessfully, you pitch something to someone unsuccessfully, right? So it's also about your interpersonal skills. So this would be another good one. And last but not least, are you easy to work with? So how would you go about answering this rather general question? And if you refer to my one of my previous videos I just published, you could go with the STAR format, but don't feel constrained about it. There are a couple of other ways to talk in a more structured format if you want to still do well in a job interview. And just as a final tip here, if you want, what are some interviewing techniques that you must be aware of? The 2 most common of them are when they stress test you on something. So for example, when they ask you 20 follow-up questions to the same main question during 1 hour of interview. And the other extreme is when you make you feel so comfortable, so they are so supportive of you that you give away even the information you wouldn't otherwise thought possible to give. So that's what I was saying, really expect to dive deep as well within these jobs interviews. So these would be the couple of tips when it comes to ensuring that you have a strong answer to working with your boss and showing interpersonal skills and reducing the risk of you showing as a potentially toxic employee in a job interview. Hopefully you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.